I hear about slack from Jeffrey Lacker, a conservative, some would suggest. I hear about slack from Janet Yellen. They're catching up with Paul Krugman. Let's review this. Why should we worry about slack?
What we're worried about is that we end up, first of all, there's a lot of wastage right now. If you believe that there's a lot of slack in the economy, that we could be producing much more, that's a lot of hundreds of billions, possibly trillions of dollars each year of stuff that we could be producing that we aren't. Unemployment is closely associated with slack, so there's lots of people who want to work and can't find jobs. But also now growing fear that if we keep the economy slack, it does long-term damage, that we end up sliding into deflation or something close to deflation, which is very hard to escape from, that we end up destroying. In the end, we destroy the productive resources. If people are unemployed for long enough, they may never get back into the workforce. If investment is depressed long enough, we never build the capacity. So if you think that there's a lot of slack, or even if you think that there might be a lot of slack in the U.S. economy, then that should be a tremendous preoccupation. We've got to get rid of that. We need to get this economy back to something like full employment. It becomes the most urgent priority we have right now.
The triage that we had in 2007, 2008 to the crisis of early 2009, by all reports, things are better. Why do so many Americans not feel better?
Well, things are better, but not a whole lot better. It's still very high unemployment by historical standards, and especially very high long-term unemployment. So that's got to be a bad thing. And of course, a weak economy, the sheer accumulation becomes a fact as well. Even if you have the same unemployment rate, or even a somewhat declining unemployment rate, once you're in year 7 of a slump, we're talking about people who've run out of savings, people who've run out of options, people who've seen their lives slipping away from them. So, no, I think people are right to feel that the things are really bad, and in some ways, not making progress because you need to be making faster progress than we are.
Chair Yellen stepped very lightly on this today, and we've heard a quiet from the conservatives, particularly at the Fed. Charles Plosser of Philadelphia, Jeff Lacker of Richmond, even Bullard out in St. Louis, and down to Mr. Fisher in Dallas. There's been a quiet as we wait for economic growth to return. If we get the Krugman stimulus, does that automatically assume we get good economic growth?
Well, no, I mean, all of this is, I think you always are talking about balances of risks, but there's a real asymmetry. If we do too much to boost the economy, well, we can pull it back. If we don't do enough to boost the economy, then it may be very, very hard to escape. I mean, look at Japan. They are in a very, very difficult situation because they allowed this slack to continue for so long that deflation got built into people's expectations. Very hard to boot yourself out. So all of too much of a good thing might be just what we need, and not enough of a good thing could be a way of really falling short.
Benoit Cœuré, the great French economist, told me in Washington last week, he was strident with the ECB. He said Europe is not Japan. The U.S. is not Japan. We hear this all the time. Why should we fear not the deflation of Japan, but why should we hear, as Chair Yellen spoke about today, the low inflation that we're living in right now? Why should we fear this low inflation? I thought that's what we wanted.
No, we wanted not too high inflation, but it's not like there's a red line. And as soon as...
Are we going to the Three Bears and Goldilocks here? We want it just right?
Well, yes, but just right. Obviously there are trade-offs, but low inflation, it's the difference between 0.5 plus and 0.5 minus on inflation is not a cosmic difference. Lots of problems crop up when you're at low inflation, and you can see it. There's a whole bunch of indicators. The number of wage earners who are receiving precisely zero wage changes is now very large, which is telling you that we have a lot of people whose, and in fact, their wages want to fall, but because we have price rigidity, they can't. We have clearly real interest rates on long-term debt would be lower than they are if we had somewhat higher inflation, and that would be encouraging investment. It's a whole set of problems that come up even at low inflation. We'd be in much better shape if we had 3% inflation than with 1%. Europe is, I have to say, when the Europeans say we're not Japan, I agree. Japan was never in as dire straits as Europe is right now. They never had the mass unemployment. There was never a part of Japan that looked like Spain or Greece does in Europe right now. So their notion that they are somehow doing better than Japan, they're doing worse than Japan ever did.
Conservatives dislike you 366 days of the year. You made them happy on tax day, April 15th, with a great essay, I thought, a fair essay about all pain, no gain. This is this raging debate which Chair Yellen addressed in her her Economic Club of New York speech. The idea that we can apply policy to one part of the unemployed and not to all the unemployed, where we can maybe affect short-term unemployment, and to how the long-term unemployed, they're a different story. Discuss the social policy of the unemployed from an economic standpoint. Can we treat certain kinds of unemployed separately?
I actually don't think so. I think that the basic problem with the U.S. economy is that there are not enough jobs. And then, given that, employers get to be picky, and one of the things they will not do is they will tend to say, who do we want to offer a job? Preferably somebody who already has one, or who lost a job only recently. So the long-term unemployed get ruled out. They get trapped in the long-term unemployment.
Have you seen long-term unemployed like this ever in your career?
No, we know that there's been nothing like this since the 1930s. This is a completely new thing for almost everybody. People who remember this in America were children when they last saw it.
Is your greatest anger that the long-term unemployed really don't have a voice in Washington?
I think there are many things I'm angry about, but that's certainly one of them. Yeah, we have millions of people who've just been ruled out of the discussion. But the way we can try to do things to make them more employable, but mostly what we need is more jobs, so that employers have an incentive to go out and look for qualified people, even if they aren't people who already have jobs.
It sounds like something in agreement. Jeff Immelt told me in the dark of the winter that just we need is economic growth to solve a lot of problems.
Yes.
The Republicans, more conservative economists, politically conservative economists would suggest that we can have an idea of raising economic growth, solving all problems. What level do you see as the proper amount of growth that we need to begin to really solve our labor challenges?
Well, I'm of the belief that we have slack in the economy. Best guess, we don't know this for sure, but I think we probably still have 5 or 6% slack in the economy. And we should be taking that up fast. We should be growing. When you're that deep in the hole, you should be growing several points above the long-run growth rate. So we should be having 4 or 5% economic growth at this point. So when we look and say, well, look, great, we're doing 2.5, that's just showing how far we've become accustomed to, how far we've become used to really dismal economic conditions.
I look at the conservative voice, and it's easy to ask Paul Krugman what the conservatives have wrong. Let me switch the table. What do conservatives get right? There's a conservative ethos in this country that's been part of our heritage. What do they get right that you respect?
I mean, there was the old conservatism. If you like, Bush 1 conservatism.
Bush 1 conservatism.
Which was one which said, look, you do need to think about incentives, that it does matter, that if you make it, well, if you set up a system as we have, where low-income people face a...
It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's a conservative from another time and place that you can respect.
Yeah, what's happened is, actually, we've had a triumph of conservative policies as happening right now. We have a conservative healthcare reform. We actually have, Obamacare is Romneycare, which is, in fact, the Heritage Foundation version, which said that you can get a long way towards universal coverage without having a national insurance system. Instead, by a combination of regulation and subsidies of the private insurance industry. And it turns out that's right. The trouble is that those conservatives have been driven out of the Republican Party and are now effectively Democrats.
Paul, you're migrating, I guess, in a year, 18 months north. Travel from New Jersey up here to the Graduate Center at CUNY, and it's a whole different landscape. I love your phrase here, you're coming up with the beards and the cheap suits, I guess, of CUNY. And the idea here, you're getting very close to Wall Street and to the lords of finance and all that they're doing now. One of the great distinctions you make, and this is something I've heard through the whole financial crisis to get a little wonky, is Wall Street likes to look at little itty-bitty changes in assets, what's called flow. Where economists, and I think of Mervyn King of the Bank of England, formerly with the Bank of England, and many other economists look at stock, which is the mass instead of the minute move. Discuss stock versus flow.
Okay, if you ask economists with a training like mine, what determines interest rates? We'll think, well, it's the amount of bonds out there and the willingness of people to hold that, many trillions of dollars of bonds out there. Which is true if you want to ask whether the interest rate is going to be 2% or 4%. if you ask somebody on Wall Street, they're not interested in whether the interest rate is going to be 2 or 4 most of the time. Mostly they're interested in what's going to happen. How many basis points is it going to move tomorrow? 2, 3, 4. That's going to depend a lot on the amount of bonds coming up for sale and the people willing to buy it day by day. And normally, people who track those flows are the people who, that's how you make money, is by being a little bit ahead, figuring out what's happening on those little changes day by day. It can be deeply misleading when the important question actually becomes, is the interest rate going to be 2 or 4%? And so living in times like this, where we have huge things at stake, where we have unprecedented, for a while, deficits, where we have a very large stock of debt, what's happening is that a lot of people who come from Wall Street are looking at the flows and they're saying, well, who's going to buy the federal debt today? Who's going to buy the debt that's coming on the market today? They extrapolated from that to think that bad things were going to happen, whereas the economists who said, well, this is mostly about people's willingness to hold those trillions of dollars of stuff, were very sanguine, and they were right.
7 years on, I was thunderstruck in late 2007 and early 2008 how no one in Washington called upon the economists. They didn't call on John Taylor. They didn't call on Paul Krugman or anyone else. You wrote about this recently. Why did no one call on the economists? They didn't want to hear the message, whether it was right or left, did they?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it takes a while. And I think even now, I mean, the trouble, this is the beards and the cheap suits, right? You got guys who aren't really men of affairs. They're not rich, maybe affluent, but they're not rich. So, I mean, most of the time, you figure that big bankers,
they've got a little more sway.
That they have more sway, and they partly because they actually, they can, maybe they can't buy the Yankees, but they can buy politicians, but also because the fact that they've made a lot of money means that they seem plausible as people who know what's going on. And actually, day to day, most of the time, they probably do, but not when you have a systemic crisis. That's when you need people who are scholars of economic history, people who really know about events that happened before they were born, because that's the time when people like me, I think, have our value added.
Is President Obama doing any better? You mentioned the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, as it's called. You have been a critic. Can you give him higher marks as he nears the middle of his second term?
Oh, sure. Look, I have constantly been saying they should do better, they should do more, but at this point, Obamacare looks like it is a success. It's not the program anyone would have designed from scratch, but it is a huge improvement in security for American lives. And just having that legacy, plus the somewhat weaker but still important legacy of financial reform, Obama is one of our most consequential presidents. You have FDR, LBJ, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama as presidents who left America a quite different place once they were done.
When you look at the ballet of economics now and the betterment we are, and Sherry Yellen talked today about we're doing better, things are getting better slowly. There's an impatience to get better faster. When we look at economic growth in this country, we want to get to a certain point. I hear a different mix each day of opinions. Deutsche Bank, Peter Hooper and his team, really are quite optimistic about where we'll be in 18 months. Can we wait 18 months for the better economy Dr. Hooper sees?
The trouble is, it's kind of, has there been any point in the last 6 years when people haven't told us it's going to be a lot better in 18 months? And maybe it's coming this time, but maybe not. And again, it's the balance of risks. If you don't do anything, maybe the 18 months from now it'll be fine, but maybe not. If you do something, well, then you're increasing the odds of something good happening. And if it turns out that it wasn't necessary to take those actions, what's the cost? So no, I think we should be vastly impatient. This has gone on. If you had said in 2007 that more than 6 years after the recession begins, we would still be talking about an economy with high unemployment, sluggish job growth. I mean, I don't know if there hasn't been a single month that I can remember when we've created as many jobs as we did during an average year during the Clinton administration, right? This is crazy. And this is the idea that this should be regarded as an acceptable pace of progress is just really, really wrong.
When you look at the economics of 2014 and you look at the work that needs to be done, people turn to textbooks, everybody agrees we're in original territory right now. We've never really seen these distortions in the system, and none of this is in Abel Bernanke, it's not in Krugman, it's not in Mankiw, it's all original. You're working on a 4th edition, I believe, of your textbook. What will be new in that textbook?
Oh, actually, I think a fair bit of it is actually in Krugman Wells. One of the things that I think has been our strength of this textbook is that we were closer to being ready to talk about this world than
liquidity trap, and
yeah,
you emphasize that over
yeah,
others.
we emphasized that in the first edition even, which no one else was doing. But no, I think we've learned a lot about the significance of debt. There's going to be a lot more about events overseas. I mean, the global system has become a lot more interesting, fraught. I mean, we didn't have the full dimensions of the European crisis in the last edition, so that'll be there this time.
It's easy to be a critic at the New York Times. Those in public policy have to be careful about every word. You mentioned international and the interdependencies of economies. Is that what I call the Twitter vigilantes? Is it so aggressive now that our public officers are almost too conservative in their messaging and their wording because they're so afraid of moving markets?
Oh, I think that's always been certainly central banker territory. I'm not sure that it is really. I think let's put it this way, it's been a long time. There was a reason why you could never understand what Greenspan was saying, because it was studied in coherence. It was part of his method, and that goes way back to the 1980s. So, no, I think the important thing is that public officials need to think very hard about what message they're trying to convey. And there's no way around that. People are going to do that.
The uproar of the recent week is away from your research, but nevertheless you can comment on it. You're with Joseph Stiglitz here at CUNY. He has the paper of the moment, I would suggest, out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, where he recapitulates a paper from 80 or 81 called Grossman-Stiglitz, one of my favorite short papers of all time. He basically says high-frequency trading has a benefit. It also has a cost, and we better beware of people having more information than the market or more information than the other guy. This phrase, asymmetric information. Explain that in the King's English.
Well, okay. And here's my understanding of what Joe is now arguing.
Sure.
So Grossman-Stiglitz, the old argument was, how do people profit from doing research? You know, you have to learn what stuff is really worth. That's great. You say, oh, if it's really good, I'll go out and buy it. But other people can observe the fact that you're buying, and the price rises, and how do you profit? And the answer in Grossman-Stiglitz was that the market has to be not too good. There has to be enough noise in the system that people who learn stuff can profit from it.
Right.
But on the other hand, you do want other people to be able to benefit from it. So you want a certain amount of imperfection. And what he's saying now is that high-frequency trading, by allowing some people to actually see your order as you try to profit from your hard-earned knowledge and front-run it, are undermining the incentive to actually create that knowledge. And so the market becomes too perfect, and this is a bad thing.
This is a critical point, folks. And this is so important. This is the heart of the matter with Michael Lewis's work and with high-frequency trading and what Arthur Levitt has done and others. If that is the case, and if we have a too perfect market, and as Joe Stiglitz says, we need to pull back from that, the bottom line is someone has to affect that. Can the government do that?
I think I don't profess to be an expert in how you can do it, but look, government has shaped the form of markets all the time. I mean, there's no law that says, there's no law of nature that says that people have to be free to build a new fiber optic cable that allows them to be 3 milliseconds ahead of the rest of the market. I mean, this is this is stuff that certainly could be regulated, and I think there's a good sense that it's actually two things. One is that the market is getting too perfect. It's undermining the work of actually discovering useful knowledge. And the other is we're spending a lot of resources on stuff that is, of zero social benefit.
Is a part of the gap, and you've been very good on this, the criticism of Main Street and Wall Street and the lack of confidence in our financial system? Is it because we have an interior belief that the smart guys have too much information that we will never have?
I actually think there's not, if anything, there's not enough skepticism. I mean, we've seen this, our financial sector has gotten way bigger, taking a lot more income.
Certainly more concentrated.
And more concentrated, but also it's grown from 4% of GDP to 8% of GDP, and it's not at all clear what society is gaining from that. And I think if anything, the general public is too willing to take Wall Street at face value as actually performing a useful service.
As we close out here in the final minutes, I want to bring it back to the core of the debate, which is inequality. And there's an idea that guys like Krugman want to push down the haves to somehow redistribute and benefit the have-nots. And the other side, of course, is this Republican spirit and this spirit of America that we can lift up with our druthers and bring the bottom up with us. Well, which can it be?
Well, I mean, there's some of both, but there is zero evidence that the kind of extreme inequality that we have is good for economic growth. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that it's actually bad for economic growth. Nobody wants us to become Cuba. The question is, do we have to have levels of inequality that are getting close to being the highest levels ever, anywhere? Right? We're really starting to set new records here. Is that a good thing for anybody? If you look at history, our own history, it's not true. I mean, the fact of the matter is, since inequality began soaring around 1980, the bottom half of America has been pretty much left behind. It has not been a rising tide that raised old boats.
What is your study of history, of economic history, of political history, of geopolitics? How does this get solved when you get to this width of inequality?
American history is actually very encouraging because in America we had we had leadership, we had people who, actually often people from the affluent classes themselves who said, this is too much, it needs to be reined in. If we could have modern politicians speaking as forthrightly about the danger of high concentration of wealth as Teddy Roosevelt did in 1910, we would be a long way towards having a good solution to this. And I guess I believe that America has a tremendous redemptive capacity, an ability to take a look and say, okay, in the end, what are our ideals? What do we want our society to look like? And an ability to step back. We don't have to become this kind of oligarchy that unfortunately we are drifting towards at the moment.
We could say oligarchy, which is too many syllables for me. Is this a gilded age that we live in now?
Oh, it's a more than gilded age. I mean, we're at gilded age levels of inequality now, and we're heading beyond. So yes, it's a gilded age. It's a belle epoque, as Piketty says. It's an era of not just of great inequality, but increasingly it looks like inherited inequality. And I think if people understand that, they'll say, no, we don't want that to happen. And we can do things that are not draconian, not socialist, but in the American tradition to limit that rise in inequality.
Paul Krugman, thank you.
Thank you.